My name is Joshua Pablo Rosenstock. I'm a professor of interactive media art at Worcester Polytechnic Institute. I'm best known as a Sci-Artist for my project Fermentophone. Fermentophone is a multi-sensory installation in which a generative musical composition is performed by live bacteria and yeast in fermenting foods and beverages. Fermentophone was featured in an exhibit at the Harvard Museum of Natural History in February 2020. I'm trained and practice as an artist, not a scientist, but I see many parallels between my interests and activities and those of my scientist colleagues. I approach my creative practice as a series of lab experiments where I try to push myself into asking new questions, pioneering new processes and materials, and learning from both my failures and my successes. Like many scientists, I practice close observation of the world around us at various scales, and I'm motivated by a desire to tell the stories of phenomena that are often typically invisible. The biggest influence on my creative work is serendipity. I like to be surprised by my own art. Most of my creations are open-ended systems that are designed to produce outcomes that I can't totally predict. In this regard, I'm influenced by folks like composer John Cage, who encouraged us to embrace chance happenings and listen for the beauty in everyday sounds, and by process-oriented artists such as Brian Eno, who coined the term generative to describe this approach to music and art that is continuously evolving rather than static. People often ask me about the Fermentophone. How did you ever come up with this? This project actually had its genesis in food rather than art, although I'm always struck by the similarities between cooking a meal and making an artwork. I had gotten very interested in the revival of traditional fermentation practices led by folks like Sandor Katz, and I was making a lot of sauerkraut, kombucha, mead, and things like that. I kept noticing the amount of intense, bubbling energy produced in my ferments, and I started to wonder if I could harness this explosive microbial life energy as a source of generative art or music. I took my fermentation from the kitchen to the studio and began to experiment with different types of sensors, underwater microphones, and algorithmic music systems. As the Fermentophone project came into focus, I started looking for ways to make the piece more public and interactive. After a few other successful exhibitions, I approached the Harvard Museum of Natural History about collaborating on an exhibit to complement their microbial life show, and they were happily very receptive to the idea. My career started with designing interactive museum exhibits, so I feel very much at home in an educational museum setting. To create the show, I collaborated with a third grade class at a local public school, with student fellows from Harvard's Food Literacy Project, and with members of the Somerville Community Growing Center to create the many colorful jars with fermenting foods and drinks that make up the striking visuals of the exhibit. One of the interesting things about the Fermentophone project is that, although it uses modern scientific tools like sensors and software algorithms, it also harkens back to the ancient science of food preservation and preparation with microbial assistance. Humans and beneficial microbes have co-evolved over millennia, and this mutualistic relationship has long shaped human culture. There's evidence that the invention of beer and bread were significant factors in the development of writing, agriculture, and other aspects of what we would consider civilization. The science of the human microbiome is still in its infancy, but it's clear that our gut microbes play a significant role in our health and even our cognition. I'm fascinated by the ways that something as basic as the food we eat plays such a critical role in what it means to be human, and yet the microbial aspect is mostly invisible. As someone who prefers to look forward rather than backward, my favorite among my creations is always whatever new thing I'm working on right now. I'm currently focusing on a different wellspring of serendipitous creativity, namely improvised jazz music, played by humans this time. I've been experimenting with using different types of video game-derived technologies to both inspire new types of improvised musical interactions, but also to render the creative choices made by improvising jazz musicians more visible to general audiences. After presenting various versions of the fermentophone publicly, I've observed that one of the reasons this piece is so successful is that different aspects of the project really resonate with different audiences. There are the foodies, who are delighted by all the different ferments and want to swap recipes with me, the microbe people who appreciate the sonification of the fermentation data, the music folks who are intrigued by the generative musical composition, the engineer types who want to know how the system works behind the scenes, and finally, people who just like art that is experiential and stimulates multiple senses.